You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Anyway, without further ado, folks, we're going to change gears slightly here, and a very good friend of the program and the head of a wonderful organization, the London Center. We have Herb London joining us, and he runs the London Center. And, of course, you have to do your very best to support them and all their efforts. And, Herb, first of all, it's great to have you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, always a pleasure to be with you. It's clearly a wonderful event when I get together with John and Brett, so thank you.
Yeah, and also, we have Thanksgiving coming up in a few days, so I hope that you and your family are getting together, and we'll have a wonderful time, and get a chance to take a day off, hopefully.
Well, look, I wish you well. I am getting together with my girls and my wife, so it's going to be a very pleasant Thanksgiving. I'm looking forward to it.
Excellent. Well, Herb, the reason I wanted you to come on today is, and this is so disturbing, of all schools, UCLA. I mean, we've discussed with you in the book that you and the fellows at the London Center have put out on the BDS movement.
Right.
And here you have the student body, again, taking up a decision to try to force the university to divest itself from any company that invests with or does business with Israel. This is appalling, it's shocking, and, well, you could tell us the story about how this came about.
Well, I think it comes about in large part because there's a kind of naivete on campus. And the Muslim student organizations are very powerful, very influential, and they're playing a role using the Edward Said narrative, which comes through in the book Orientalism, which any student in the Middle East is reading. And by and large, what you have is a student population that has come to the conclusion that Israel is the imperialist, Israel is the enemy, Israel is undermining the Middle East, when in fact Israel is the only democracy, the only stable nation, the only nation that really wants peace in the region. So it's thoroughly misguided, but this is part of Nakba, or what the Arab narrative suggests, is the tragedy of the Arab world. And it's a tragedy because they believe that in 1948 there were so many Arabs displaced by the Israelis, lost their homes, lost their property, and they want to recapture that in the form of the right to return as well as reparations that would be made to the Arab people. Well, there were 400,000 people. They were told in 1948, 400,000 Arabs were told in 1948, leave your homes and you will return after the war. They did so because they believed in the Arab leaders who told them, vacate your homes during the course of this war. Of course, they anticipated an Arab victory. That did not happen. So the Israeli victory, which was won in 1948 and created the State of Israel, that victory is now what is clearly at stake and what the Arab narrative is all about. They do not want a State of Israel. It's not a question of the West Bank. It's not a question of converting the West Bank and Gaza into a Palestinian state. It is a question of creating a state from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. And that is what Israel is facing. That's what these kids are led to believe, and that's one of the reasons why this movement is so dangerous.
I don't know if you had a chance, but in the weekend's edition of the Wall Street Journal, there was a piece by Andrew Roberts entitled "From an Era of Refugee Millions, Only Palestinians Remain." And
yes, I did read the article.
I thought it was a superb article, just for the fact that they really pointed out some key factors. How many times people have been forced away from their, whatever it is, wherever they were set up to do business, or wherever their homes were, whatever country they happen to be living, to have to relocate somewhere else. But in almost every single case, they have decided to acclimate and to go about their lives, becoming a vibrant part of the communities which they now live. And the only remaining, or one of the few, if not only remaining groups of people that you could point to that refuse to do this are these Arabs or the Palestinians that are in the West Bank and Gaza. And in some cases, people in the West Bank are going about their business, but clearly they refuse to do what anyone else around the world wants to do, and will continue this fight. And I think it's about time that, especially the administration that we have in the White House right now, but it's about time that many administrations and governments around the world start to recognize what these people are really doing, and that it's time to support Israel, and that is the only way you will ever get peace.
Well, I think supporting Israel is the only way you get peace, but let me just make a statement about the Palestinian cause. Well, I think it's thoroughly misguided. The Palestinians are used as pawns. The United Nations recognizes only one refugee group in the world, the Palestinians. They do not recognize the roughly 800 to 900,000 Jews that lost their homes in Iraq and Iran and Yemen, all over the Middle East, were forced out of those territories. They are not considered minorities. But it's true that the Palestinians represent a cause that can be exploited in the United Nations by the Arab states. And so the 57 Arab states use the Palestinian cause in the same way that Dr. Valier exploited poverty in Haiti. And people would come to Haiti and they would see kids with flies all over them and distended stomachs, and they'd say, we've got to do more. We've got to give more money. Well, the same is true with the United Nations and the Palestinians today. Money is poured into UNRWA, the organization, the UN organization that deals with refugees, specifically the refugees in the Middle East. And money pours into UNRWA through the United Nations, and it's designed for the Palestinians. Well, it's what sustains those Palestinian societies. Without that kind of money, there is nothing in the Palestinian territories that would allow it to survive. They must have that money. And so if you remove the refugee camps, there isn't any justification for doing so. So the idea that they would somehow find their way and acclimate to the larger society is not possible when, in fact, all of the forces within the United Nations are saying, we want these Palestinian camps because they become a way of generating support for the Palestinian cause in the Middle East.
Herb, you know, because you have been there yourself on numerous occasions, that even the term refugee camps is a complete misnomer, because if you're there, they actually look like and are functioning cities, irrespective of the poor governance behind them.
Without any question.
And I want to take this to a slightly wider view, which is I have many frustrations with the fact that both Clinton and Bush did not follow through on moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. But Obama has taken the lack of support for Israel to a whole new level. And I'm just leaving D.C., so I apologize for the background noise. But so this problem that I see here is Israel has always had U.S. behind them to protect them at the UN and otherwise. That is still the case, largely both Democratic and Republican from the Congress, but not from the president. And because the State Department is at the beckoning call of the president, my concern is that there is no longer U.S. air cover protecting Israel. Ergo, this BDS is just a subset of this delegitimization, marginalization, and ultimately path to destruction for Israel. And whether we're talking about Iran getting the bomb, or whether we're simply talking about the issue we opened up on, universities training the next generation to have anti-Semitism flow through their veins, my hope, and I wanted to get your opinion on this, is that the next president, hopefully Republican, will not only restructure the relationship to let Israel know that we understand we have their back, but that will go full out in countermanding the UN's efforts, many of the Europeans' efforts, as well as to move the embassy to Jerusalem, which I think symbolically is critical to change the direction of this conversation.
Well, number one, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that the embassy should be in Jerusalem. Jerusalem should be seen as the capital of Israel. That should be unequivocal. That should not be a matter of debate. This is the capital of Israel, period. Now, the second point that you've made about the lack of support from the administration, that does strike me as a matter of great concern. If, in fact, some sort of deal is going to be struck in 7 months with the Iranians, it's going to be a deal whose contours are already very clear. And what that means is the Iranians will possess fissile material to produce a nuclear weapon. They just won't produce a nuclear weapon. But they could produce it at any time. Give them 3 weeks, 4 weeks, they'll produce a weapon, and they can use their missiles, which they haven't parked in, which are not part of the deal, by the way. That's off the table. They can use those missiles to deliver a rocket to Israel. That would have a nuclear warhead. So, I mean, this is a very, very fearsome proposal. And it's a proposal, a scenario that elicits great fears about the likelihood of nuclear proliferation in the area. Now, if the United States is unwilling to play a role in providing the kind of deterrence that Israel would need in the scenario that I've just described, then it seems to me not only is Israel on its own, but then Israel has to strike first. Israel has to attack Iran. It has no alternative because Iran becomes an existential threat, a threat that for the very survival of Israel. And under those circumstances, without American aid, Israel is entirely on its own and would have to do something. Now, the Sunni nations, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, will probably breathe a sigh of relief and say, thank God Israel is going to attack. But they're certainly not going to assist. Maybe they'll put little arrows in the sand in the desert saying this way to Iran. But they're not going to do any more than that. So, again, Israel is entirely on its own without the United States. So this becomes critical. We've got 7 months to think about what kind of deterrence will be put into effect if the scenario that I've just described is the likely outcome of this arrangement or agreement. They're not going to call it a treaty because then it would require Senate confirmation. But the point behind all of this is that without the United States, Israel is obliged to do something. Its very survival will be put at stake. It's not surprising that Khatamei, the fellow who is the head of the Iranian world right now, the head of Iran, said last week, I'm quoting, there is no cure for Israel, there is only annihilation. There is no cure for Israel, there is only annihilation. Well, what about the state that has nuclear weapons that says we must annihilate Israel? What do you do under those circumstances? Preemption is the only thing that you can do. There is no alternative. And so we've got stark choices. People say, well, increase the sanctions regimen. Well, the sanctions regimen hasn't stopped the continual enrichment of uranium. The sanctions regimen hasn't stopped Iran from moving ahead and developing its plutonium. So what you have is a very, very interesting set of conditions. Everyone says war is a terrible choice. But is it a worse choice than Iran with nuclear weapons? It is a worse choice than the possibility of a nuclear exchange in the Middle East, setting back civilization millennia. So I think that what we're talking about now are very stark and awful choices, any way you look at it. But for Israel, there is no choice. Either it strikes or it finds itself in the position where it's supine and can do nothing.
Wow. Herb, I have a handful of questions here just based on this Iranian discussion. And the first one I would say is, the U.S. provided, because they attacked Iraq preemptively, a precedent for Israel to have to respond to Iran in the event that they feel threatened by a nuclear program. But in addition to that, here's a question I have for you, I guess like almost a three-part question. One is, what did the United States get in return for any of these extensions of times which have been granted to Iran? Two, when Benjamin Netanyahu gave that speech, I believe it's to the United Nations, where he pointed out the red line in the time of when Iran would cross the point of no return, I believe that June of 2015 would be past that point. And then my third part is, if we allow Iran to have a nuclear program the way we are, aren't we opening up a nuclear arms race with the Saudis or the Egyptians or Turks or other nations within the Middle East and possibly Africa? I mean, this is the opposite of what Barack Obama argued for when he said, let's get rid of our nukes.
Well, the one thing that I can assure you of is that the day the deal is struck, and maybe even before the deal is struck, Saudi Arabia will have its order into Pakistan for nuclear weapons. So we're talking about nuclear proliferation, and we're sure, I'm absolutely positive, that Saudi Arabia is first in the queue. The second point about this is that there is no doubt that Israel is put in this odd position now. And since they cannot rely on the United States and feel that a bad deal is likely, you may remember Netanyahu saying no deal is better than a bad deal, but a bad deal is likely. The United States wants a deal. They want this to be the legacy of the Obama administration, so they can say we've prevented Iran from having a nuclear weapon. And technically that will be the case, because they'll say, you know what, don't weaponize now. You have the fissile material, don't do it now. That's why I call it the Japanese solution. In Article 9 in the Japanese Constitution prevents Japan from having nuclear weapons, but it doesn't prohibit Japan from developing fissile material. So they could build a nuclear weapon. And that will be the kind of attitude that will exist in the dealings that take place over the next several months before the final achievement of some sort of understanding. And if anything, they'll probably say, you've got 1 year. That is, don't do anything for 1 year. Everyone is now talking about the 1-year solution. And by the way, everyone in Washington now uses that expression. So when they're saying that, there's probably some truth to it, that within 1 year, Iran will be able to obtain a nuclear weapon, but not before that. So in 7 months, the arrangement will be fissile material, don't produce the bomb now, give Obama the opportunity to, with great fanfare, say, through skillful negotiation, we've stopped Iran from having nuclear weapons. Will Israel be satisfied with that deal? Of course not. Will Israel be obliged to do something? Of course it will. So you're kind of forcing Israel's hand. The Israelis understand that. They've gone to Washington. They've tried to talk to the State Department and the President about this. They're not interested because they want a deal. And the only assurance they can provide Israel is, we will do everything that we can to assist you. That doesn't mean anything. The other part of this is you raised the question right at the outset, what are the concessions that the Iranians have made? And I asked a senior senator about this yesterday. I could not get an answer. I said, well, be precise. Tell me, what are the concessions? I know what the United States is willing to do. We're willing to grant them X number of centrifuges, somewhere between 1,500 and 4,500 centrifuges. So it becomes a technical question. But I'm saying, what have the Iranians done in the way of a concession, other than engage in the talks? The talks happen to be the concession. We've even moderated the sanctions regimen in order to accommodate the Iranians. So we are making the concessions. Nothing has been conceded from the other side. And when you have in the backdrop of this kind of negotiation, the most important leader in the country saying that we must annihilate Israel, you've got to wonder, what is going on here? What are the United States people, the United States spokesman in Vienna really thinking? So this is, in my mind, one of the most momentous decisions that has been made in human history. It is not a moment for us to simply say, oh, this is yet another foreign policy agreement having no influence or no consequences for us. The consequences are enormous. And what is at stake here is civilization itself. And if, in fact, we go through nuclear proliferation and the possibility and the plausibility of some sort of nuclear exchange, we're setting back mankind at least 1,000 years. So, I mean, this becomes a very, very powerful moment in human history. And the game of chicken is being played with with Iran having a full house, and we're sitting there with a pair of deuces. Well, I mean, if you understand the table stakes, you realize we don't really have a very strong hand.
Well, not anymore because we gave it up. But, just to wrap up this discussion on Iran, I feel this administration is really, with the actions with Iran, have emboldened the Russians, the Chinese, anyone in the Middle East, and in particular ISIS or ISIL or IS, whatever we want to call them, to continue to challenge us. And this is going to lead to a lot of conflict in the future and a lot of loss of American troops, because we'll be forced to engage in one way or another, whether they want to or not, because of bad policy.
Well, I think you've got a weakness that is evident to most of the bad actors on the world stage. They understand that this Obama administration is really not willing to make the military commitment to defeat ISIS. Look, ISIS is a force that was really created by Petraeus in a strange way, because he understood that we had to create the Sunni militias in order to offset the influence of the Shia in Iraq. And so he's largely responsible for this army that has emerged. But it's a well-trained army, but it's only 30,000 troops, maybe 40,000. It's certainly not that large a force. And the equipment they have is all American equipment. Now, while it's fairly sophisticated, they don't know how to use that equipment. You send in 2 Marine brigades, and in 2 weeks' time, you could probably wipe them out. But the problem is that this government is unwilling to put boots on the ground, or sufficient boots on the ground, to really make the case for a victory. And that's one of the problems. You can't fight these wars incrementally. Either you fight to win, or you don't fight at all. And one of the problems you have, we're sending in 10 sorties a day into the area in Iraq and in Iraq and Syria. We're sending in 10 sorties a day. Well, in Fallujah, we sent in 700 to ferret out 3,500 terrorists. 700 sorties. Now we're doing 10 sorties a day. So we're fighting this with kind of Marquis of Queensberry rules, and the other side is saying, we don't have any rules at all. We're barbarians. We'll do anything that we think is necessary to achieve victory. So it's a strange kind of administration policy. It's a halfway policy. We're not in, we're not out. We're not willing to do enough to win. We're not willing to do enough to simply lose. It's a peculiar arrangement that has been put in place by this administration, which in part, I think, explains why Hagel has resigned. Because the generals are saying to him, Mr. Hagel, what we've got to do is we have to put in a real force. And the White House is saying, no, we're not going to do so. So, the White House is saying, look, we want a direct line to the generals. We don't want them to go through the Secretary of Defense. So you're going to get a very, very weak Secretary of Defense. Not that Hagel himself was the sharpest blade in your knife drawer. But the fact is that we've got to do something more if we want to win, or we simply got to leave. And those are the options, just as the stark choices that I made reference to before in Iran are very, very obvious. I mean, I hope that sanctions work. I would like to think that they would work. But they certainly have not introduced enough pain into Iran for them to cease their uranium enrichment program. And that really is the key. That was the purpose behind sanctions in the first place. People say, well, it brought them to the negotiating table. Well, the negotiating table has only given them everything they wanted. It's given them the opportunity to continue to produce uranium, enriched uranium, with the legitimacy of the world community looking on and saying it's okay. And it's given them the opportunity to even modify the sanctions, which have been modified in order for them to engage in the talks. So they've gotten what they've wanted right from the outset. It's not at all surprising. It's not at all surprising that the game of chess was invented in Persia. It wasn't invented in the West. We play checkers, they're playing chess. It's been said many times before, but people overlook the fact that Persia invented chess. They're very clever. And what has also happened that is overlooked, completely overlooked, no one has said anything about it, is that as these negotiations are going on, the Revolutionary Guard in Iran managed to capture all of Yemen. It's now controlled by the Houthi rebel force, which owes everything to the Iranians. The Iranians are supporting them. They provided the weapons. What does that mean? Well, not only does it give them access to a staging area against Saudi Arabia, since Yemen is right on the southern tip of the peninsula, but in addition, who controls the access to the Red Sea and the Sea and the Gulf of Hormuz? Who controls both of the important petroleum sea lanes in the world? Iran. No one is saying that. I haven't seen any article. Talking about this. It's almost as if the geopolitical dimensions of this are completely overlooked. But now Saudi Arabia is locked in. If tomorrow the Iranians say, you know what, you got to drink your oil because you can't transport it anymore, what do they do? What do the Saudis do under that circumstance? I can say, the United States, help us out here. But again, the entrance to the Red Sea, as well as the Gulf of Hormuz, now both blocked by Iran. It's an astonishing development that has gone virtually unnoticed and should be part of these negotiations that are taking place in Vienna. Not a word has been expressed about this matter, just as not a word has been expressed about the leading figure in Iran talking about the annihilation of Israel. Why would he say that in the middle of negotiations? I mean, isn't that odd in itself? I mean, even if you believe that, why say it now? So, I mean, we are reaching a point. We are reaching a point of no return, and it's a very, very, very difficult situation to simply observe from afar and say, let's hope for the best, because that appears to be the strategy.
Right, absolutely. Herb, unfortunately, we're out of time with the segment today, but first of all, your comment on the sea lanes is so important. I'm glad that you brought that up. But I want to give you one more opportunity to give a plug to your BDS book and why we should be paying attention to what the student body did at UCLA. And also, your website is londoncenter.org. I encourage everyone to go there, not only to find out information, but support the London Center and Herb.
Well, thank you so much. Look, I appreciate that. The book is called The BDS War in Israel. It is written by Jed Babin and yours truly. It is available on Amazon. You can get it for $8 if you buy just the electronic version, or I think it's $10 or $11 if you buy the hard copy. I would urge your readers to get it because it provides all of the arguments for why the BDS movement is so dangerous and gaining traction across universities in the United States.
Great. Herb London with the London Center, thank you so much for taking the time. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving with you and your family, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.
Thank you so much. All the best. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care.